What are JMeter variables and properties? JMeter has a few types of variables. It can be user-defined variables, user parameters, functions, or variables defined in an external script, for example, in a Bean shell script. For today's session, we'll be focusing only on the user-defined variables and the user parameters. JMeter has three types of properties: the system properties, the JMeter properties, and the user properties. The JMeter variables can only be set between the test plan, while the JMeter properties can be set outside or inside the JMeter test plan. For example, you can set a property in the command line or by passing a property file to JMeter when you run it. The user-defined variables are constants. They are kind of static variables. They are initialized at the start of the test plan and cannot be changed when the test runs. The user-defined variables can be set in two ways in your script. Let's move to JMeter to create our script. We have a test plan, and inside the test plan we have a thread. We can create the user-defined variables inside the test plan in this section, or the second option is to add a config element to our test plan, the user-defined variable. Let's add our first variable. By clicking on this button, we define the name of the variable, which we will call the host, and let's add the value, which will be demoblaze.com. Now, how can we use this variable? We will add to our thread group a HTTP request, and instead of defining the server name or the host name, we are going to use the user-defined variable that we just created. Variables in JMeter start with the $sign and contain curly braces. So we said that we are going to use the JMeter variable called host. Let's add a listener to our test plan, the view results tree, and let's run this test. We will see that the host name is going to be the value that we declared on the test plan, www.demoblaze.com. If we go into the view results tree and we analyze the request, we are doing a GET request to that specific host. Now let's add another variable, but this time we will add it to the user-defined variables config element. So we add one, and let's define a new variable which is going to be called the path index. And the value for this one will be index.html. Now if we go back to our request, we will call that specific variable, which is called path index. Let's save it and let's run again this test. So now the request will be to demoblaze.com/index.html. And we can see our final request. The user-defined variables declared in the test plan are kind of a global variable. They can be used everywhere in the script. But the variables that are defined in the user-defined variables element have scoping dependencies. So where they are will affect where they can be seen. If I move the user-defined variables up here, then they will have the same effect that defining the variables in the test plan. But what happens if I move the user-defined variables inside this thread group? Then only the elements inside this thread group can see the variables defined in this element. If I add a second thread group to my test plan, they won't be able to access these variables. The advantages of the user-defined variables is that they provide one place to set a constant value that all threads will use. There are cases, however, where we want a separate value for each thread, and that is the use case for the user parameters. Let's add a user parameter to our script. So we go into the thread group, add a preprocessor user parameters. This panel allows you to specify a series of values for any user variable. For each thread, the variable will be assigned with one of the values from this table. If there are more threads than values, then the values are going to be reused. Okay, and let's add another request to our thread group. The first one was the homepage request, and the second one will be the view product request. We will reuse the host variable, but now we will add a second variable, which will be the path for the product, and this is called prod.html. So here we will use the second variable, which is called path product. Okay, and now for the request to view a product, we need to add a parameter which specifies the ID of the product that we want to see. So this is the name of the variable. And then we want to have a different value for each thread, so we don't always hit the same product. So we go into the user parameters preprocessor, and the first thing is that we are going to add a second user, and then we will add a variable. So now the name of the variable will be the product ID, and for the user 1, it will check on the product number 1, and for the user 2, it will check on the product number 2. So let's save it and go back to our view product request, and the value will be the variable that we just defined, which was with the name product ID. Let's save it. Let's add to our thread group a second thread so that we will see both values, and let's run again this test. When we run this test, we can see that we have two requests to view product. The view product request number 1 is using the ID product with the ID 2, and the second request is using the ID product number 1. So we are obtaining those values from the user's parameters. Let's move to the JMeter properties. The JMeter properties are global and can be defined outside the test plan. The properties control various aspects of the behavior of a JMeter, and they can access and manipulate elements of your test plan. Let's go back to JMeter and understand how these properties work. So we have a very simple script, and I will add to my script a debug sampler. And in this debug sampler, I can set up if I want to see the values of the JMeter properties, of the JMeter variables, or of the system properties. So I will check everything on false, but we will only see for now the system properties. We save it and we can run once this test. If we go to the debug sampler and the response data response body, we have a list of all the system properties. So these are all the system properties, and most of them are kind of inherited from Java, as JMeter it's a Java application, and JMeter provides a file which you can use to override or to add a new property to this property file. So if we go to the directory where JMeter was installed, inside the bin folder, we'll find the system properties file that we can open it, and we can see it from here. Now, the JMeter properties are similar to the system properties and are used to pass data between thread groups or to store something more permanent where JMeter variables cannot be used. So predefined JMeter properties are defined in the JMeter property file, which is stored in the same location in the bin folder. So let's open this file, the JMeter properties file. You can see that the JMeter properties file is divided in categories. So for instance, the properties for the XML parser, for the SSL configuration. Now let's go back again to JMeter, and now instead of seeing the system properties, we would like to see the JMeter properties. So let's run again this script. And if we run it, we can see now all the JMeter properties defined in that file. Here it's a list of the JMeter properties. Almost any area of the JMeter application can be controlled with the properties. For example, the parents, the time times, the output files, and even low-level parameters such as the HTTP client, the timeouts, etc. And it is a good practice to override or to add new properties in the user property files rather than the JMeter property file itself. So in other words, you should treat the JMeter property file as a read-only and add or modify the user property file. And again, this user property file is located in the same directory. We can see it here. One more type of property file is the custom property file that can be passed to JMeter as a parameter. And we can do it in the console. So we can just start JMeter from the console and add -p and specify the name of the custom property file. For instance, custom properties. Remember that these files need to exist, and you need to specify the correct path for this file. Now, as we have different types of properties files, we need to understand how priorities work for all these files. So the first priority file that it's applied is the JMeter property files or the custom property files, then the user property files, and finally the system property file. Another way of changing or defining properties values is with the JMeter's functions. So let's open the function helper dialog where we can see the properties, and we have three functions to use. The first one is the set property, and then we have the property and p, with it's the same as the property but in a shorter way. So we will start by setting a property. Okay, and we define the name of the property, which is going to be called test1, and the value is going to be the value of test1. So we can generate this function and copy it, and we will paste that function in the request data of our dummy sampler. Now let's add a second thread group to our test plan. We add the dummy sampler to our second thread group, and now we will get the value of the property that we defined in the first thread group. So let's open again the function, and instead of using the set property, I will now use this one to get the value. And the name of the property was test1. So we can just get it. And we will obtain it in the response data. Before running this test again, I will change the name so that we can identify it. This is the one and this is the first one. So now, yes, let's run it. And we will obtain on the response data of the sampler 2 the value of the property that we set on the sampler number 1. So if we check on the dummy sampler 2, the response data, we are obtaining the value of the property with the name test1.